Okay, I am trying to set it up so we can see. Okay, it doesn't look like there's anybody else here right now, but I want to move. There we go. Now I've got the controls over here.
I was going to ask you, do you want to start right on time or do you want to wait for folks to join?
We will wait for folks to join. And Mika, I'm going to also make you, can you see folks joining right now? Because I can see that on my end, and it might be because you're a panelist and not a,
Yeah, can you make me a co-host, please?
yeah. Let's see. I think I can.
Cool. Yeah.
Okay. So no, we will give folks a couple of minutes to join before we get started. For those of you that have joined us, welcome. You should be able to see my PowerPoint, Rights of LGBTQ Students in New York. And as Mika and I were just mentioning, we're going to give folks a few minutes to join us before we get started. All right. For anyone that's just joined us, we are going to get started in a few more minutes. We are just giving folks a moment to log on. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Anna Brem. I'm an advocate from Advocates for Children. And we're going to be talking tonight about the rights of LGBTQ students in New York. And Mika, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Micaela or Mika, and I'm also an advocate for our Immigrant Students' Rights Project here at AFC.
All right. So we're going to get started tonight with an introduction. We will, and an overview of the rights of LGBTQ students. Then we're going to be talking about gender and sexuality at school and how those rights can be exercised. We'll move on to talking about bullying, harassment, and discrimination, school options, and the ability to move or change schools for LGBTQ students, LGBTQ students in discipline, LGBTQ students in temporary housing, and then we will wrap up with resources and where to go for more support. So just to start us off, as Meek and I mentioned, we are from Advocates for Children. We're an independent agency that protects the rights of all New York City students. So we have a helpline that anyone in New York City can call. It's open on the dates and times that are shown on the slide here, but you can always leave a voicemail and we'll give you a call back. We also have guides and resources available on our website from everything from the rights of LGBTQ students to resolving transportation issues, applying for OPWDD, everything that you can think of related to education in New York City. We provide workshops and trainings like this that are online and public or in person in public. We also take requests for workshops and come into schools, community organizations, and we gear those presentations towards professionals, towards families, towards students, whoever that audience is. And similarly to our guides and resources, we can really cover anything related to education. And then we provide free legal services to students and families of low income. So based on what we're seeing in those direct service cases, we also do policy advocacy and impact litigation work. So just to start off, we want to define shared language. We're here because we want to talk about and reassure folks that the rights of LGBTQ students in New York are the same as they were before the federal administration changed and before recent executive orders came out. Before we get into all of that and the laws and the policies that we're going to be referencing, we just want to define shared language. So when we say LGBTQ, in writing, that would be LGBTQ plus, just for brevity's sake, as I'm speaking, I'm just saying LGBTQ, and that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. Gender identity refers to a person's experience of their own gender, a person's innermost concept of self as masculine, feminine, a blend of both, another gender, or none. So I think of that as who someone is. Sexual orientation, on the other hand, is a person's identity in relation to who they are attracted to physically, romantically, and or emotionally. So where gender identity is who someone is, sexual orientation is who someone's attracted to. So just keep in mind that that language can change over time. This is just one small set of terms. It's not all inclusive and it's not final. So as we think about the rights of LGBTQ students, you'll hear us reference certain laws and regulations where those rights are derived from. Students, in order to exercise their rights, do not need to be able to cite or quote the law that gives them that right. They have the right, whether they know which law it's from. We just include this information to ground us and to help us, especially in times like these, to help us understand where the rights come from so that we can understand whether they're threatened or not. So Title IX is a federal law and it protects against sexual and gender-based harassment and discrimination. We also derive a lot of rights from New York State human rights law, so state law. And then for the New York City School District, we've got the chancellor's regulations. There's a few different chancellor's regulations that cover specific things, but oftentimes they are, those different regulations they go into quite a bit of detail of not just what the protections are, but how they actually work in practice. So at the school district level, what is the policy for reporting and handling staff to student discrimination, for instance, or student to student sexual harassment? Those chancellor's regulations can be really helpful to read through. They're not as dense and legalese heavy as, say, Title IX or New York State human rights law, and it can be helpful for professionals and families and students to read to get a sense of what the protections are and what they're actually going to look like in practice. There's also a few key New York City public schools policies. That I absolutely recommend reading. Um, those are the guidelines to support trans and gender expansive students and the guidelines on gender inclusion. There's also the Student Bill of Rights, and Mika is linking all of these in the chat right now. We will share the PowerPoint, and these underlined words are links, even though they're not bright blue. So you will be able to click through when you have the slides, but if you're interested as we're speaking, you can look at them through the links in the chat. The Student Bill of Rights is something that applies to all New York City students, and it's a little bit broader and isn't specifically about LGBTQ students. But the two sets of guidelines on the top of the slide are really helpful for students and families to look through because it lays out exactly in categories that are as specific as really as the categories that we're going to be talking about in this training: names and pronouns at school, participation in sports, locker rooms. It breaks down exactly what New York City public schools policies are, and how they'll work in the specifics of our school system, and what to do if those policies are not being followed. So this is something that we will talk a little bit later about what to do if something isn't happening. But these they're written in plain language, they're accessible, and these can be really helpful to reference as your kind of your first line of defense when you're talking to your school or to your to district staff. And then we have at the state level, kind of a parallel to that guidance, which is the New York State Education Department's guidance on supporting trans and gender expansive students. Similarly, this is very detailed, goes into quite specific language about exactly what the state policies are and exactly how they're going to be practiced. And really what that means is exactly how trans and gender expansive students in New York State are protected. So all of these policies and laws predate the administration. Now we're going to talk about recent statements that were made since the change in federal administration, and really since the more recent executive orders that theoretically would target and affect LGBTQ youth, and specifically LGBTQ students. So there are two statements that are linked here. We've got the joint statement from the New York State Attorney General and the New York State Education Department on trans students' rights. And then we have the message for families that was sent out by New York City Public Schools. It was a letter from the chancellor about the supports for LGBTQ students. This was a letter that it's available on the DOE website. That's where we link to it here. But it was also something that was emailed out and sent home with students. And that message really affirms the school district's ongoing commitment to protecting the rights of LGBTQ students. I do want to go into a little bit more detail about the Attorney General and the State Education Department statement, because I think it's helpful in that it breaks down exactly why and how all New York State public school students, so that, at the beginning of this PowerPoint, I think we said New York City on the front slide, but we're really talking about things that apply to all New York State students that attend public schools, including charter schools. So for folks that are watching or listening from Long Island or school districts outside of the city, this information also applies. So there are two executive orders, and the statement's only a page long. I do recommend reading it, but I am going to kind of break it down a bit here. It's really in response to two executive orders that purport or attempt to restrict K through 12 schools from supporting trans students' social transition and their access to athletics, i.e., to play on sports that teams that are in line with their gender identity. So this statement says quite clearly that these executive orders do not affect the rights of trans students in New York State public schools. So how is this possible given how frighteningly worded those executive orders are? Well, there's three things. So first off, an executive order cannot restrict the meaning of sex. The word sex in Title IX, sorry, this is Title 10, that should be Title IX, to exclude gender identity. In order to do that, in order to change a federal law, which Title IX is, you would need an act of Congress to change that law. An executive order on its own cannot change that law. So that's the first one. The second piece is that even if the executive order could accomplish what it wanted to accomplish by changing federal law, New York state law offers protections and school districts must follow state law. So even if the federal law were to change here, the state law is very clear that trans and LGBTQ students are protected. We'll go into the specifics of exactly how, but in all the ways that they were protected in the city and the state before the change in federal administration, they continue to be protected by state law, and school districts within New York State are required by law to follow that state law, regardless of what federal law says. And then finally, because these executive orders use a lot of language that talks about funding for school districts, it's a lot of talk about money. It's important to remember that funding levels from the federal government are decided through a process involved. Sorry, I was making an edit to this last minute. Funding levels from the federal government are decided through a process involving Congress. So for reference, about 5% of New York City public schools budget comes from the federal government. The rest comes from the city and the state. So that's for New York City public school, 5% from the federal government, 95% from the city and from the state. The funding levels that New York City schools do get from the federal government, so things like Title I funds for low-income schools or IDEA funding for students with disabilities, those amounts, those funding levels are decided through a process that involves Congress. So once again, this isn't something that can be unilaterally decided. It's something that is going to be decided through a process that would have to involve Congress. All right, and I'm going to pass it over to Mika.
Thank you so much for starting us off, Anna. So I want to just start this section off by affirming LGBTQ plus students' rights here in New York City. So here in New York, LGBTQ students have the right to 1, feel safe at school, 2, be safe from bullying, harassment, and discrimination, 3, be out or not at school, and lastly, to freely express their gender. So we're going to go more into depth about specific policies like bathroom access, locker room access, gender neutral dress codes and language, names, pronouns, and so on and so forth throughout the rest of this presentation. But this is really important as kind of the overarching themes across the policies that we're going to discuss. Ultimately, it's really important that we get across that LGBT plus students are entitled to safety and to freely be themselves at school, whatever that might mean for them. And I'm so sorry, Anna, thank you so much. So firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about names and pronouns at school. So schools here in New York must address students by the name and pronouns that they choose to use. This does not require the parent's consent or legal name/gender marker change. This can simply be from the student's, vocalized preference. Refusing to use the student's preferred name or pronouns and intentionally referring to the student as the incorrect name or the incorrect pronouns, whether that be verbally or in writing, is bullying or harassment. And we'll also talk a little bit more about what that might entail later in the presentation. The principal is responsible for enforcing this policy with all staff, and staff must then ensure that other students use the student's correct name and pronouns. So, if a student were to be enrolling in a DOE school, the student can and should give their preferred pronouns and names to the school staff, to their peers, and to whoever they may feel comfortable with. Name and gender in New York City public schools are self reported and do not require documentation. So, we're going to talk about how to report bullying or harassment and discrimination if it does come up, if name and pronouns are not respected. But it's important to understand that schools do have a responsibility to address students by the pronouns that match their personal gender identity. And the gender identity that they consistently assert at school is the language that's used, even if the student hasn't legally changed their name yet. So the next slide is actually continuing on this idea by talking about updating school records. So if a student chooses to use a different set of preferred name or pronouns, and they want to update their non-permanent records, such as their school ID, their middle school diplomas, guidance logs, graduation programs, sporting rosters, yearbooks, and other forms of kind of non-permanent informal records, then the only thing that they need to do in order to change their name and pronouns there is ask. The school cannot require documentation in order to update the student's name or gender marker in these non-permanent records. And then moving on with permanent school records, whether that be official report cards, transcripts, high school diplomas, IEPs, this would require an ATS update, which would also require parental consent unless the student is emancipated or 18 and older. If any school staff has any questions, or if you're a parent and you're trying to get this process started for your student, then you can always reach out to LGBTQ at schools.nyc.gov. And, they really are there to guide students and families and staff through these processes. So continuing on with updating permanent school records, there's also kind of two branches to that. So if a student is currently actively enrolled and they'd like to update their permanent school records, they can do so if they have a legal name/gender marker change. They would bring a court order showing this name change or documentation of the legal change of gender marker to the school. And at the school, they can just ask the ATS be updated. And that's the process that would occur. If the student were to not have a legal name/gender marker change, then they could submit this form, the name and gender change request form. It would be signed by the parent unless the student is emancipated or over 18. And then similarly to if they did have a legal name change, it would still be able to move forward. Now, let's say a student has already graduated or they're currently right on the cusp of graduation, they're leaving a school, and they want to update their permanent records. So in that case, they would contact the old school with documentation of their legal change of name or gender marker. The school would then forward this request to the assigned academic policy, performance, and assessment specialist who would update ATS. The DOE has transgender student guidelines that requires schools to do this. And again, schools must address students by pronouns that match the gender identity that they consistently assert at school. So while what we just discussed was a little bit more pertaining to changing these school records, at the end of the day, students have the right to feel safe in their school, and that includes being referred to by their preferred name and pronouns, even without any formal requests or documentation being filed.
And then one quick thing I want to add before we move on to the next slide, because we got a question about this when folks registered for the Eventbrite, was the form that Mika mentioned, the name and gender change request form. I'm circling it with my mouse. Hopefully that shows up on your screen. The question was essentially, how secure is that form? Is that something that essentially do we need to be concerned about that the confidentiality of that form? So, like all student records, right, this would be protected by FERPA, which is a federal law. So I understand that might be concerning, but FERPA is the law that protects the privacy of student data. And essentially, it's in order to, for instance, when Mika or I requests documents or records from the DOE or from a school for a student, we have to have the student's parent sign a FERPA release, which says that this person has my permission as the student's parent or guardian to access the student's information. Parents always have access to their students' information as the parent or guardian. And we'll talk a little bit more about student privacy. If they are not out to their parents, we'll talk a bit more about that later in the training. But in order for an outside agency, an outside perhaps government entity to access these name and gender change forms, they would either need to be given FERPA permission, FERPA release by the parent. There would need to be a health or safety concern for the student. So in the same way that ACS can access student records, if there is a health or safety concern, theoretically, a government entity or another agency would, sorry, not other agency. Oh, this is only true of ACS. ACS could theoretically access these forms if, along with other student records, if there were a health and safety concern. But in that case, if it's ACS doing it, then you need to think about ACS's policies, and they are very trans affirming, very LGBTQ affirming in policy and protocol. So in order for it to be for another government entity to request this information, at that point there would need to be a legitimate health or safety reason why they needed to access the student's information. So if this is something that you have more questions about and a specific hypothetical, please do feel free to reach out to AFC. But I would think of this information like any other information, any other records that the DOE has on students, and it is protected. Okay. So moving on to bathrooms and locker rooms at school. So students can use the bathroom or locker room that aligns with their gender identity. As Mika said, when we talk about, for all of these permissions, you can use the bathroom that aligns with your gender identity. This is just about the gender identity that you assert at school. There does not need to be any legal gender marker change, and you don't even need to change your records in ATS. If I assert that my gender identity is something, I can use the bathroom that's in line with that gender identity. In line with that, schools cannot force students to use an alternative facility, such as a gender neutral or single occupancy restroom or changing area. So what this really means is that if I am a girl and I want to use the girls' restroom, I can use the girls' restroom. The school cannot force me as a trans student to use, the single stall bathroom in the nurse's office or the accessible bathroom or the teacher's bathroom. I can use the general girls' bathroom that aligns with my gender. If I need or want extra privacy because of my gender identity, however, the school must let me use a gender neutral or single stall bathroom just because because it's a single stall, it is more private. But they can't force me to do that. That's really my choice. And then if a student wants to keep their transgender status confidential, their bathroom, changing area, or changing schedule, like if they're changing for sports or PE, must allow them to do so. So essentially, in all of these cases, schools need to work with students to give them the flexibility and the privacy that they need. Okay, so there are some gender inclusive school-wide policies that we want to talk about. So according to the DOE style guide, schools should use gender neutral language in all written communication. So that means that anytime a letter gets sent out by the school, an invitation to something, a message to families, whatever it is, there's no reason, and there's Beyond there not being a reason, schools should not use gender-specific language. So there's no reason to say girls and boys, men and women. You can just say students. You can just say families. Um, Moms and dads, same thing. Easy to just say parents, families, students. Um, in terms of admission to single gender schools, students are eligible based on their gender identity asserted at school, even if not in ATS. So, as Mika started us off by talking about, there is a process to go through to update your gender identity in ATS. ATS is the DOE computer system that stores student info. So, everything from like my name, my address, my parents' contact info, so if I am, let's say, applying to high schools and I want to apply to an all-girls high school, even if ATS isn't updated to reflect that as my gender, I can apply if that's the gender that I assert at school. If ATS isn't updated to reflect my gender identity, I just need to work with my guidance counselor. I just need to tell them that I want to apply to that school. And then the school guidance counselor will work with the Office of School Enrollment and the senior field council to do what needs to happen on the back end technology wise, so that I can enter the admissions process for that particular high school. In terms of gender-based policies, rules, and practices, schools should remove any policies or practices that do not serve a clear instructional purpose, like gender-based superlatives, like, funniest girl, funniest boy, gender-based graduation attire, girls in white, boys in blue, things like that, lining up by gender, so like alternating by gender. There's no reason for any of those. They have no pedagogical purpose. They have no educational purpose. So much like using gender neutral language in all written communication, this is just something that the DOE has a strong policy to, let's just not do it, right? We don't need to, don't do it. We don't need to force students to every day have to explain that they are trans or to explain their gender identity. Um, Students must be allowed to participate in all school activities according to their gender identity. So if there are groups or activities that serve a pedagogical purpose and are divided by gender, then students have to be allowed to participate in line with their gender identity. I can join the girls group, right? If that is the gender that I assert at school, I can join that activity. Okay, so then a few more like school-wide policies that the DOE says must be gender inclusive. So dress codes, schools can have dress codes, but they have to be gender neutral. It's not that there's a boys dress code and a girls dress code. Same thing applies to all students. Student clubs must be open to all. Um, so same thing like we talked about with activities. Anyone who wants to join can join. Health classes and sex ed classes must be inclusive, affirming of LGBTQ identities, and they cannot be segregated by gender. So it's not that there should not be a girls sex ed class and a boys sex ed class. All of the middle schoolers, all of the high schoolers, whatever it is, should be together in the same group. So for PE and sports, schools may not separate by gender except for contact sports. And then students must be permitted to participate in PE, intramural sports, athletic competitions, and contact sports based on their gender identity. So essentially what this means is that like PE and sports, all students should do those activities together unless it's a contact sport, in which case they can be divided by gender. But I can participate in the contact sport group that aligns with the gender identity that I assert at school. So I should not be, although there could be a boys football team, a girls football team. If I identify as a girl, I can play on the girls football team. If I identify as a boy, I can play on the boys football team. For paired or partner activities, the policies that schools cannot use gender-specific rules or roles. I'm sorry. The example that I am always forced to think of is the fact that I had to do square dancing in elementary school PE, and there was a boys' role in the square dance, and there was a girls' role in the square dance. Um, Luckily for New York City public school students, you can't do that. I hope they also have banned square dancing, but they have definitely prevented the gender specific roles. Okay, so I talked a little bit before about privacy and supporting students. So FERPA, that federal law that we mentioned, protects the privacy of student data and information held by schools. FERPA protections apply to any info that schools have. So that includes, like, if a school knows about a student's trans or gender expansive identity or sexual orientation, those FERPA protections apply. So what does that actually mean? That means that if, you know, random person calls the school and asks about a student's gender identity, sexual orientation, in the same way that the school cannot share information like, oh, yes, that student does attend our school, or that student is in Miss Anna's English class and she's getting an A in the class. In the same way that they can't share that information with a stranger without appropriate permissions, the school cannot share information about a student's gender identity or sexual orientation with a stranger without FERPA permissions. So, how would you get FERPA permissions? Like I mentioned, perhaps this is an actual advocate or professional working with the permission of the parent. The parent or guardian can give permission for a third party to access information about a student at school. But even to someone who does have FERPA permissions, schools must consider whether it's necessary or relevant to disclose that information. So, the example, the kind of most obvious example here would be parents and guardians. So, not all students are, it's not safe for all students to be out to their caregivers. Only the student knows whether it's safe to share their identity, sexual orientation, gender identity with their parent or guardian. So, a parent doesn't need to sign a FERPA release to access information about their student, but schools are not required to disclose a student's identity to caregivers, and they should only do so if it's safe to do so, which again, only the student knows. Um, and they really need to balance, they need to consider the student's health and safety as they balance supporting a student with keeping their parents informed, right? So perhaps a student is um, transitioning at school, or they have voiced to a safe, trusted adult at school that they're trans and that they're thinking about transitioning at school. That is a great opportunity, and this is where I really recommend reading the guidelines, because I think the guidelines go into great detail of exactly what this looks like and exactly how it can be done, or not how it can be done, what should be done. So, where appropriate, trusted school staff should meet with that student. They should ask that student, like, is it safe? Do you want me to invite your parent, your guardian, your caregiver to participate in this meeting? And then have a conversation with this student. The first conversation is, would it be safe to share this information with your parent or guardian? Perhaps they want to discuss like a timeline for their formal gender transition at school. How do they want teachers to refer to them? How do they want their classmates to refer to them? Is this something that they kind of want to gradually do? Or tomorrow, do they want to transition completely in terms of being referred to by their name, being referred to by their pronouns? When and how and do they want to change their information in school records, right? If this is a student who is not out to their parents or guardians, perhaps they don't want to change uh, their school records. But that, like we've said, schools should still refer to them by their name and gender and name and pronouns. And then any other measures that would create a sensitive, inclusive environment for the student. Okay, and I will pass it back to Mika.
And so, as we continue to talk about affirming the rights of students in schools, another right that students have is to a Gender and Sexuality Alliance, or GSA. So student-run clubs that provide a safe place for LGBTQ plus students and allies to meet, find support, and plan activities. It doesn't necessarily have to be called a GSA. There are so many names for these kinds of clubs now, but essentially the point is that it's a student-run club that provides a safe place. These kinds of student organizations can decrease anti-LGBTQ plus bullying and harassment on school campuses, and they help make students feel safer and more comfortable. So under federal law, the Equal Access Act, which, I know that right now we're in a time where a lot of things are changing at the federal level, but just to provide that reassurance at the moment, as of now, there are no direct attacks towards the Equal Access Act. And so this information remains true. Under the Equal Access Act, public schools cannot prohibit students from starting a GSA if there are other non-academic clubs at the school. So for instance, if a school only has a math club per se and no other kind of non-academic club, then in that case, the school could say that, they don't want a GSA to be started on their campus. However, the second that there is a baking club allowed, then there can also be a GSA under federal law. So all student clubs essentially have to be treated the same way. And they also have equal access to school resources. So what this also means is that if the math club was given $100 in funding for an event that they're hosting, then the GSA also has the right to seek out those funds, to apply for those funds, and to maybe obtain those funds depending on, the individual situation. Um, Equal access entirely. And then moving on from the school organization, what if a school doesn't follow these policies? So we've talked a little bit about name and pronoun changes, bathroom use, and gay straight alliances. And so what if a school doesn't follow these policies? Um, this can be a series of steps to follow in order. This graphic that we're showing here, it can really be a good reference point to see as you're thinking about escalating an issue. And so we'll walk right through it. The first thing that one should do is to share this. So with this, we can refer to the schools to the DOE's guidelines to support trans and gender expansive students, or their guidelines on gender inclusion. And so if we're feeling like the school maybe isn't adhering to these guidelines, we can share this information with them so that they're aware that these guidelines exist and these protections exist. If this continues to make us feel uncomfortable, then we can connect. We can talk to the school's Respect for All liaison, which all schools have, and there's more information to come on that. Or we can talk to the school's principal. If we feel that this isn't working, then we can email respectforall@schools.nyc.gov, or call the number on the screen. And that would be to contact the Respect for All at the district level. Then if we're seeking to get more support, as we previously mentioned, you can always email lgbtq@schools.nyc.gov. And lastly, if you're seeking to really enforce something, you can always file a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity, or the OEO, which we'll talk some more about later. And you can file one of these complaints online, or you can call the number on the screen. So like I mentioned, the graphic here can be either a series of steps that you can follow in that order, or you can always jump around if you feel unsafe at any point of this process. If you feel that maybe the student's school or the student's principal isn't a safe place to come, bring this issue to, then you can always go above and directly contact the Respect for All liaison, or lgbtq@schools.nyc.gov. And so parents, families in general have the right to decide which step is best for them. But this is just to show just how many avenues are available to families so that they can seek out support if the school isn't following the policies we just mentioned. And I'll give it back to Anna to talk about bullying.
All right. So, like all New York City students, LGBTQ students are entitled to protection from bullying, harassment, and discrimination. This is one of the things that's protected by the chancellor's regulations that we talked about at the beginning. Students are protected whether they identify as LGBTQ or gender non-binary, or if someone thinks that they do. So, let's say that a student is being bullied because of their gender identity. They don't, or they can be it can qualify as bullying whether they are being bullied for their actual gender identity or the gender identity that someone thinks that they have. Um, so the definition of bullying within New York City public schools is that it's physical, verbal, social, written, or electronic behavior or actions that create a hostile environment for students. So if it affects the students' learning, if it affects their mental, emotional, or physical well-being, if it causes fear for safety, or it causes or could cause physical injury or emotional harm, it's bullying or it's bullying behavior. So not all of those things have to be true. These are different examples. Um, a student does not have to be physically harmed for before it reaches the threshold of being considered bullying. It can simply be that I fear for my safety, and it can be that my emotional or mental well-being is affected. So the DOE is responsible for addressing bullying that happens on school grounds or on school property, even if it's before or after the school day, at a school sponsored event that is offsite, that's not on DOE property, on school buses to and from school, even if it involves students from multiple schools, since we know that school buses often have students from multiple schools on the same route, and outside of school. This is where cyberbullying would come in if it disrupts learning or harms the school community. So if it's affecting a student at school, which, even if I'm experiencing bullying online at night, but I'm then coming back to school with the same group of students who are exhibiting bullying behaviors, of course it's going to affect me at school. And that means that it's still the DOE's responsibility to address that bullying. And when we say address, what we really mean is to uh, stop it and to prevent future bullying. So the DOE's required to do these 4 steps proactively in terms of preventing bullying. So this is what just every year schools need to do before even a bullying incident it occurs and before something's reported. So they always have to proactively have a plan. They need to create a plan to prevent and address harassment, intimidation, or bullying. I should have flagged this. I'm saying bullying throughout. When I say bullying, you can know that I'm referring to harassment, intimidation, and bullying. It's all kind of lumped together. Then they need to share the respect for all, which is the DOE's policy promoting respect for all to create inclusive school environments. The idea is that if you are promoting respect for all, bullying will decrease and be prevented. That policy needs to be shared with students and parents annually. And then the Chancellor's Regulation A832, which is the Chancellor's Reg that specifically prohibits bullying and explains what will be done, has to be made available to parents annually. There also is proactive training that needs to be done. The RFA, Respect for All Liaison, is a person on staff. It's one of it's a what's the word for this? It is a responsibility that is added to someone's role as opposed to their job title. Oftentimes, it is a guidance counselor or a parent coordinator, but this is a staff person at school who is the point person for all things bullying, harassment, or discrimination. And they are responsible for implementing the DOE's Respect for All program at their school. Schools need to train all students and staff on bullying policies by October 31st every single year. And then when we get into the actual action, which is like if bullying behavior occurs, it needs to be reported, it needs to be investigated, it needs to be stopped. So respect for all. We linked to the DOE website describing the policy here, but like we said, it's a DOE program. The goal is to promote diversity, promote respect for diversity, and provide a safe and supportive learning environment for all students by preventing discrimination, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. All schools have an appointed RFA liaison, and they're the point person, right? They're specifically trained, but all school staff have a responsibility to report and to play a role in addressing and preventing bullying behaviors. So I'm going to pass it to Nika to talk about reporting bullying.
Thank you so much. Okay, so once we, have an understanding and we believe that bullying has occurred, we can talk a little bit about reporting bullying. So bullying can be reported online by calling 311 or by emailing respectforall@schools.nyc.gov. And there are some overall kind of rules for reporting bullying, or not rules, but rather things that remain true. And that is that anyone can report bullying, and it can be reported to any school staff, whether that's a teacher, a principal, anybody who the family feels safe with. Any report can be made in person, it can be made by phone, but it's easiest to track when in writing. And so that's important to note as well. Reporting can be done in any language. And so that language access piece is also really important to us. And we ask that families always provide as much detail as possible when reporting bullying. So when we talk about reporting bullying and tracking it in writing, this means that, for instance, if you were to make a verbal report, then you should always ask for a copy of the Department of Education's online occurrence reporting system. So I'll explain a little bit of what that is in just a second. Basically, the Department of Education has a system called the Online Occurrence Reporting System, or ORS, OORS. And this is a system that New York City public schools use so that if a student reports bullying, a family member reports bullying, then the staff member needs to make a report on this online platform within about 24 hours of this report occurring. And so if you were to report something by phone or in person, then we do recommend, just as a tip, to always ask for a copy of this report and a reference number. This should be provided to you within 24 to 48 hours of your report. And this is just so that you can make sure that whatever incident it is that occurred has been recorded, and the fact that you reported it has also been recorded in case this does escalate. Something else that's really important to always keep in mind is that you cannot be retaliated against for reporting bullying. This means that if you report bullying, you should never feel like a teacher or a staff member now is punishing you for that. And if you feel that this has happened to yourself, your child, or your student, then this absolutely can and should be reported at the district level. And then we'll talk a little bit about responding to bullying. So this is a really good graphic that I'm going to explain in just a second. But it's important to note that it's a cycle, it flows. It's not necessarily one to the next. So we can start out with reporting. Let's say that you have identified that your child is being bullied and you've reported it verbally to their teacher. Then you've asked for the ORS report to be provided to you. And so you've reported. It has to be entered into ORS within 24 hours, and the investigation must happen within 5 days. So this is what the timeline looks like when flowing from the reporting circle to the investigation circle. Again, within reporting, if any school staff sees or learns about bullying, they must orally report it to the principal within 1 school day. They must file a written report within 2 school days. If a principal or Respect for All liaison hears about this, they must enter that report within 24 hours. And if a report is made directly to the district, then it is then relayed anonymously to the school, and the same exact process occurs. So then we move on to the investigation part of the flow chart. Within 5 days of this report being made, the principal must investigate in order to determine whether they believe bullying occurred or not. This investigation would include interviews with all of the student parties, whether that's the affected students, the accused students, any witnesses or bystanders. And then there's also a review of any other relevant evidence. This is especially relevant in the case of cyberbullying, for example. The DOE must provide interpreters for these interviews if it's necessary. So if a student only speaks Spanish, for instance, then a Spanish interpreter has to be made available in order for the school staff to speak to the student and really be able to get a full picture of what it is that's occurred. So once the investigation is complete, and again, it must begin within 5 days of that report, then the principal must make a determination. So they must determine whether their behavior that has been reported is bullying, harassment, or discrimination. And a lot of families at this stage really want to know what factors has the principal considered in order to determine whether or not bullying has happened. And so it really is case by case and it's very individual, but oftentimes some factors that are considered include the age of the students, the severity of the behavior, whether it's become a pattern or not, the context of the behavior, so on and so forth. Schools must inform parents of both the affected and the accused students of the results of this investigation. And this is where it's very important to know a few things. First of all, if a family member disagrees with the decision that's been made based on this investigation, then they do have the right to ask for a reinvestigation or ask for another conversation with the school staff, with the Respect for All liaison, and with the principal. And this is true for the families of the affected students, to the students being bullied, as well as the students exhibiting bullying behavior. Another thing that's important to note is that oftentimes families of affected students or students being bullied want to know maybe if their child's the accused student or the student exhibiting bullying behavior towards their child has been disciplined. Have they been suspended? Have they been expelled? So on and so forth. It's really important to note that the families of affected students are not entitled to know how the DOE is addressing the bullying with the accused student. They are entitled to know what kind of supports will be in place now for their child. They are entitled to know what's being done for the safety of the student, but they are not entitled to know specifics about what action has been taken against the student exhibiting bullying behavior. And that's another thing that's important to know. And so that's the response on the school's end. And another thing that's important to note is that all of this must be communicated to parents and families in their language. So language access continues to be very important here. So then based on the response, whether that be restorative justice circles, mediated conversations, then we step into the prevention circle, which is really just about preventing the bullying from occurring again. It's important to note that this is a cycle because if families view that the bullying behavior continues, then they have every right to report once again and open up another investigation and escalate it to that level. So it doesn't have to end with the very first report. If the family feels that the student continues to be bullied, then they absolutely can open up another report and the process begins all over again. And if anybody has any questions, then please feel free to leave them in the chat and we can answer them at the end. And so what if the school says that it isn't bullying? So going back to the previous slide, what if after the investigation, the decision that the school comes to is that bullying did not occur? Well, in that case, the family of the student who has been bullied can contact the principal once again. If they feel that the principal is not being responsive or not being collaborative, they can also email the Respect for All liaison at the district level at respectforall@schools.nyc.gov. Another step of escalation would be to call the school superintendent's office. And there is a link on the slide when those are shared that will give you that information. And then lastly, if the family feels that this is not being taken seriously, that it's not being addressed in the way that they'd like to, within 30 days of this decision, they can always file an appeal with the Commissioner of Education. Again, similar to the last flow chart, this can be helpful to view as a series of escalated steps that one can take. But if at any point families feel unsafe with any of these offices, then they can feel free to jump around from one to the next. And then what do schools have to do to address and prevent bullying? So this is really important to know. Schools should recommend supports for all students involved, whether this is the student that is being affected by the bullying behavior or the student who is exhibiting the bullying behavior. There are a variety of ways to support students, but the very important thing is that all students involved must be supported. And this kind of support can really range. It could mean individual counseling, it could mean behavioral supports, academic supports, so on and so forth. And when we talk about all students who are involved being supported, this could mean, really opening up learning opportunities for schools. So for instance, if a student who is a member of the LGBTQ plus community is facing bullying, then a form of support that the school could provide, it could really open up an opportunity to provide school-wide trainings to combat homophobia, as an example. But right here on the screen, there are some other examples of, other avenues that the school can take. And then we'll talk a little bit about safety plans as well. So when it comes to preventing bullying, another aspect that the school can do, or rather another avenue that the school can take, is to ask, I'm so sorry, my dog is being really loud. Another avenue that the school Another avenue that the school can take is to ask the school for a meeting to create a safety plan. So families and members of the school can ask to change a student's seats, schedule, programming, so on and so forth. The things on this slide are just an idea of what can happen in a student's safety plan. But really, the main point is that families are always entitled to speak with the school and to set up a safety plan for their student.
Okay. So if a student with a disability experiences bullying or exhibits bullying behavior, the IEP is one more avenue for families to think about as an IEP meeting can be an opportunity to talk about the bullying incidents, to talk about concerns. It can be an opportunity to, and families can absolutely request an IEP meeting to have that discussion. For the IEP itself is also an opportunity to recommend supports. So families can ask IEP teams to mention bullying in the IEP and add supports and services that could help. And this can be both for students on both sides of the experience, right? Students who exhibit bullying behavior and students who have experienced it. Um, if the student's behavior is affecting their ability to learn, this is an opportunity to ask for a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan. So, what if the school does not address and prevent future bullying? We recommend talking to the principal again. At the district level, email Respect for All. They will follow up at the school level. Call the school district superintendent's office, email LGBTQ at schools, and call AFC. We've mentioned LGBTQ at schools a few times throughout this presentation for a lot of different reasons. They are the office specifically focused on supporting LGBTQ students. Because they are at the district level, they have the opportunity to provide, to kind of push into schools and provide specific targeted supports. And also, for instance, like the Respect for All office, to see things at the district level and make sure that schools are following district policies. If you are not satisfied with the school or district level response, you have the right to file a complaint with the New York State Department of Human Rights. The hotline number is here, or to file a complaint with the Federal Office of Civil Rights. In order to file an OCR complaint, it must be filed within 100 days of the incident. So we mentioned the Chancellor's Regulation A832, which protects against bullying. Title IX and Chancellor's Regulation A31 protect students against sexual harassment by other students. In order to report it, you'll follow the steps here. I do want to move on just given the time. But like the other escalation paths that we've mentioned in the past, you can start at any point on this process. And if one doesn't work, you can move on to the next one. In terms of bullying or discrimination by school staff, whether it's towards students or families, actions by school staff can also be considered bullying, harassment, or discrimination, again, towards students or families. To report corporal punishment or verbal abuse, you'll follow this first path, and it would be investigated by the Office of Special Investigations. You can submit that complaint yourself online directly or by calling, or you can tell your principal and they would go to OSI. To report discrimination or harassment by school staff, you would contact the OEO, Office of Equal Opportunity. Again, you can do that online via this form, or you can call that number. For students who, the DOE, even if the DOE has successfully addressed and prevented bullying, and the student still does not feel safe in that school, or because of what has happened, they cannot and do not want to return to that school, or in situations where schools have not effectively responded, students do have the option to change schools. These types of transfers are not unique to LGBTQ students. I'll talk a little bit about like the specific ways that they might manifest for LGBTQ students, but this is something that's available for all students. So it could be that the student gets a safety transfer. A common misconception here: a safety transfer does not require there to be, an incident of physical harm. It doesn't require you getting a police report. Risk to physical, emotional, or mental health is sufficient. And to request this type of transfer, you should talk to your school or go to the Family Welcome Center. It is helpful to bring any documentation that you have, but you don't need a police report. A guidance transfer is for students who are not progressing or succeeding, whether academically or socially, in their current school, and going to a new school would address those concerns. So in order to request that, you would go to the Family Welcome Center with supporting documents that show that the student isn't making progress academically or socially. And then at that point, you can discuss it with the Family Welcome Center. A medical transfer is an opportunity for a student who needs a new school, either because of a physical disability, an illness, pregnancy, or mental health needs. To request it, you should submit a letter from a clinician or a provider explaining the medical condition and why the student needs to change schools. This is something that we've seen for students who are starting hormone therapy and who are transitioning. Perhaps they don't feel comfortable transitioning in their current school. They want a fresh start. Medical transfer is a great opportunity for that. So also, these are a little bit less relevant, but just throwing them in just in case they're helpful. There's a travel hardship. So if a student lives more than 75 minutes away by public transit, just bring proof of address, proof of that long commute to the Family Welcome Center. And then if a student goes to a charter school, they always have the opportunity, not just the opportunity, the right to leave that charter school and attend a DOE school instead. Some alternative school options. There are transfer schools. These are schools for older students who are behind in credit. They often have smaller classes and can give more individualized attention. Harvey Milk is a transfer school that's specifically designed for LGBTQ students and their families. So it's just a very welcoming, inclusive place. James Baldwin is a supportive and inclusive transfer school. And then Broome Street Academy is a charter transfer school that's actually at the organization called The Door, which has a great, really, really great services and supports that are at The Door. And this is the school that's actually just associated with The Door. There also are YABCs, Young Adult Borough Centers. These are evening programs for students who can't go to class during the day. Perhaps they're working during the day or they have other family responsibilities. It's an opportunity. It allows students to earn a Regents diploma, even if it is a slightly less traditional school setting and it's in the evening. And then there are high school equivalency programs, which are programs to earn a high school equivalency diploma by taking the GED exam. Lots of different programs. The DOE and other community orgs offer different programs. Mika, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay. And so we'll talk a little bit also about LGBTQ plus students and discipline. And so this is kind of on the other side of reporting bullying, and it's talking more about students experiencing discipline. So research suggests that LGBTQ plus students experience higher rates of school discipline. And this is important to know because schools cannot discipline students based on their gender identity, their gender expression, or their sexual orientation. And they also cannot retaliate against students for reporting bullying. So if a student feels that they are experiencing school discipline because they reported bullying, then this would be a case of retaliation. If a student faces school discipline for any of these reasons, then they should absolutely file a complaint with the Office of Equal Opportunity. If a student is receiving a superintendent suspension, for instance, then they should proceed to a hearing, and they should really highlight the discriminatory reason for the suspension at the beginning of this hearing. But overall, I mean, really here at AFC, we really support students who are going through suspension hearings. And so if at any point, a student is going through a suspension hearing, whether it's an LGBTQ plus student or not, then, or whether it's retaliation based or not, then absolutely families should reach out to AFC and always feel free to do so. Then LGBTQ plus students in temporary housing. So students in temporary housing have certain rights, and the same remains true for LGBTQ plus students in temporary housing. Specifically for the purpose of the statistics that we're going to share, it does not necessarily include trans students because transgender students do tend to face even higher rates of some of these. And so the study specifically focused on LGBTQ students and found that LGBTQ high schoolers were almost twice, a little bit over twice as likely to experience homelessness than their straight peers. Their transgender peers were almost 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than their cisgender peers. LGBTQ students experience homelessness, who also experience homelessness, miss school at twice the rate of their straight and housed peers due to safety concerns. LGBTQ youth are also 3 times more likely to be bullied on school property and twice as likely to be cyberbullied than their straight peers. And so it's important that we kind of set this context for LGBTQ plus students in temporary housing and the kinds of supports that they can receive in addition to this. So the next slide talks a little bit about that. Students without fixed, regular, or adequate housing are considered students in temporary housing. And I previously mentioned that students in temporary housing have a little bit of, not a little bit, they have rights that they're entitled to. And temporary housing includes not just students living in shelters or students living not within a shelter. It also includes students who are temporarily staying with friends or students who are sharing someone's apartment. So if a student is couch surfing, if a student is staying with a friend's family, then that's what's known as doubling up. And that is a student in temporary housing. This also includes youth who were kicked out of their home or who have ran away from home. A lot of these students may be staying in a runaway and homeless youth shelter. They may, again, temporarily be sharing some housing, couch surfing. Other forms of temporary housing might include staying with a family member impermanently. So there's a lot of ways to really identify what a student in temporary housing is. And these students are protected additionally by the McKinney-Vento Act, as well as the Department of Education Chancellor's Regulation A780. Again, these names don't have to be memorized or known, but it's just important to have as a grounding point. Some of the rights that these students have is that they have the right to choose to remain at their current school or return to their school of origin, or enroll in a new school near where they are staying. Along with this enrollment piece, they also have the right to immediate enrollment. So many of these students may not have access to the documents that are traditionally asked for during enrollment, and that is perfectly okay. Under McKinney-Vento, these students are protected and they have the right to immediately enroll even without access to these documents. They also have the right to transportation to school. So if a student is currently experiencing homelessness and, you know, maybe they previously lived in Brooklyn and now they're staying in the Bronx, as a student in temporary housing, they have the right to access transportation to the school that they choose to remain at. And continuing on with students in temporary housing, unaccompanied youth, again, are students in temporary housing who are also not living with their parent or guardian, or pardon me, yes, who are also not living with their parent or guardian. So these are students who have the right to make decisions about school enrollment without their parental consent, with the help of a students in temporary housing regional manager. And again, as we previously talked about, this is very important contextually because LGBTQ plus students are at a much higher risk to be in these kinds of situations. So these students, again, have the right to make these decisions on their own. They have these entitlements according to McKinney-Vento, and they can also apply for federal financial aid for college as independent students without providing their parent or guardian's financial information. This remains true within FAFSA. And so they are afforded some extra entitlements, as well as they remain, holding on to a lot of rights that they previously had. And I'll give it back to Anna.
All right. I'm just going to wrap us up by showing you all where you can find supports and resources. So, in terms of school-based supports, if you're familiar with schoolsearch.schools.nyc, just the way you look up your student's school and information about it. So you would search for the school name here, click search, and then when you click into the actual listing for a particular school, if you scroll down and then click on the mental health and wellness tab, you can see a variety of supports that are available. Some of these are supports that are available to all schools, and then some are going to be specific to a particular school. So, for instance, this school has a school-based mental health clinic with Aster. So, always helpful to see what's available at your student's particular school or when you're considering schools for a student. If you click the little tab next to school contacts and information, you'll see the school leadership team and then specific points of contact. So, for instance, like we were talking about Respect for All and who the point of contact is for all things bullying, although you can always report to any school staff member, the RFA liaison is going to have specific training. So, for instance, at this school, we see the Respect for All liaison listed here. There's also a sexual harassment prevention liaison who could be a good point of contact depending on what your student may be experiencing. And then in terms of resources that are specifically for LGBTQ students, we've got that LGBTQ email that we've mentioned many times, the guidelines that we've talked about, the state guidance. AFC has a great guide, not to be biased, for LGBTQ students. There's the end of that guide has also a very detailed resource page. Goes into really like specific practical information related to what we've shared here, like how do I do a name change at school? How do I make sure that my school is following these policies? Things like that. Then we've got for DOE staff members who have access to InfoHub, we have the DOE LGBTQ support InfoHub page. You need a DOE login to access that. And then we've got the DOE inclusive curriculum resources. So I answered this in the Q&A, but also wanted to point it out. This does not require a DOE login to get to, and you can see all sorts of inclusive curriculums that have already been created. And this could be a great thing to like, hey, school, how about could you use this for Pride Month, or could you just use this generally? And the work of finding those resources has already been taken care of for you. And then finally, we have the joint statement from the New York State Attorney General and the New York State Education Department on trans students' rights that I discussed at the beginning of this training. So as we've said, Advocates for Children provides lots of workshops and trainings. We are staying on top of everything that's happening federally. We have a great newsletter that goes out weekly. There's a monthly newsletter, and then there's a different letter that is weekly, Blackboard Bulletin. So you can sign up here, whether through the short bit.ly link or by scanning the QR code for that newsletter. And we would greatly appreciate it if you filled out the survey to give us your feedback, to let us know how to improve our workshops, what you liked, what you didn't like, what to do differently next time. And then always you can reach out to Helpline with any questions, any needs for support. You can call Helpline. You don't just have to call during those times. You can always leave a message. And you can also always email AFC at info@advocatesforchildren.org. So wanted to just briefly answer a couple questions that we got in advance of the workshop. We talked about how secure the name and pronoun change forms. The other piece that I wanted to answer was what supports are available for LGBTQ DOE staff. So you are, for that, I would recommend going to the Office of Equal Opportunity within the Department of Education. You are similarly protected, in this case, by your union, and I would reach out to your union for more support there. But there is a mechanism to report the to report any harassment or discrimination that school staff experience through the Office of Equal Opportunity. Thank you all for joining us on a Wednesday evening. We appreciate it. All while navigating daylight savings time. If you have any questions, please reach out to Helpline. Please email info@Advocates for Children, and we will be sending out the slides, and the recording for this training is also going to be available on AFC's website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.